She didn't just kill her victims, she boiled them. In the heart of a quiet Italian town during the 1940s, a modest kitchen concealed a horror that would scar history. Inside a large black cauldron, something unspeakable bubbled away. Flesh melted into fat. Bones softened. The remains of human beings, mothers, sisters, daughters, were reduced to liquid. From that same cauldron, soap was poured into molds. From the same mixture, Leonarda Cianciulli baked cakes, their batter enriched with human blood. She served them to neighbors, to friends, even to police officers who stopped by her door. No one suspected that the kindly woman offering pastries with tea was feeding them the remains of her victims. Her motive was not greed, nor lust, nor rage. Instead, Leonarda believed that murder was an act of sacrifice, that every body boiled away was an offering to fate, a dark ritual to protect the lives of her beloved children during wartime. The world would come to know her by a name as grotesque as her crimes: La Saponificatrice di Correggio, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. Before we dive into her crimes, tell us in the comments from where you are watching, what time it is, and subscribe to educate yourself on historical serial killers. Leonarda Cianciulli's story is one of the most disturbing in the annals of true crime. Unlike the infamous killers driven by sadism or sexual perversion, Leonarda's motives were rooted in maternal obsession and superstition. She was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. She was a trusted neighbor, a fortune teller, and a respected member of her community. But behind that facade lay a mind twisted by trauma, paranoia, and folklore. She believed her life was cursed, that she had been doomed from birth. And when Italy plunged into the chaos of World War II, those beliefs escalated into something far darker. Leonarda was not content with praying for her children's safety. She demanded assurance, and in her desperate logic, human sacrifice became the only path to survival. Over the course of just 2 years, 3 women would walk into her home, each seeking comfort, opportunity, or a new beginning. They would never walk out again. Instead, they would vanish into farewell letters written under her dictation, their bodies broken down in that infamous cauldron. This is not just a story of murder. It is a tale of superstition, survival, and a woman who loved too fiercely until that love consumed others. Welcome to the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. Leonarda Cianciulli was born on April 14, 1894, in the small southern Italian town of Montella, nestled in the province of Avellino. The Italy she was born into was a place still clinging to old-world beliefs, a land where Catholic tradition intertwined uneasily with folk superstition, and where poverty shadowed most households. For Leonarda, life began not as a blessing, but as a curse. Her mother, Emilia Dinolfi, had been forced into marriage with her father, Mariano Cianciulli, after becoming pregnant through coercion. From the start, Leonarda was a child of resentment. Her mother never forgave the circumstances of her conception, and she made sure Leonarda knew it. Beatings were common, words sharper still. Emilia would often remind her daughter that she had ruined her life, that she was unwanted, and that misery was all she would ever bring. Growing up in this hostile environment, Leonarda was plagued by loneliness and despair. She was a frail, anxious child, prone to fits of sadness. By her teenage years, she had attempted suicide more than once, a grim foreshadowing of the darkness that would define her later years. In her mind, she was cursed, singled out by fate itself. Superstition was not unusual in rural Italy at the turn of the century. Fortune tellers, palm readers, and folk healers were woven into the fabric of everyday life. But for Leonarda, these beliefs did not exist on the edges of society. They consumed her. She grew fascinated with prophecies and the idea that destiny was already written. Every misfortune seemed to confirm her deepest fear, that her life had been doomed before it began. When Leonarda was still a young woman, a fortune teller delivered a prophecy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Looking into the girl's palm, the seer told her, "You will marry and have children, but all your children will die." Another told her she would end up in prison or in a criminal asylum. To most, such words might have been dismissed as melodramatic, but to Leonarda, fragile, beaten down, and deeply superstitious. These predictions were carved into stone. Her adult life began with more rebellion than freedom. Against her mother's wishes, Leonarda married a registry clerk named Raphael Pansardi in 1917. Emilia had wanted her daughter to wed a wealthier man, and she cursed the marriage in fury. For Leonarda, that curse felt real. And soon she would find herself carrying the weight of her mother's hatred, convinced that fate had already turned against her. The early years of her marriage were marked by turbulence. The couple moved often from one town to another, never settling for long. They eventually relocated to Lauria, in the southern region of Basilicata. But even as Leonarda tried to build a stable life, tragedy followed her. She became pregnant numerous times, only to lose many of the children. 17 pregnancies. That was the number Leonarda endured over the course of her life. Of those, 3 ended in miscarriage. 10 children died in their youth. Only 4 survived into adulthood. Each loss pushed Leonarda deeper into despair. She clutched onto her surviving children with a grip that bordered on obsession. To her, their survival was constantly under threat, balanced precariously against the curse she believed her mother had placed upon her. Every sickness, every accident, every war rumor confirmed her terror that she would outlive them all. Her psychological state grew fragile. She suffered from seizures and bouts of depression, though at the time such conditions were poorly understood. What neighbors saw was a nervous woman, prone to fainting spells, who nonetheless doted fiercely on her children. But behind closed doors, Leonarda carried the crushing conviction that she was battling not just illness or bad luck, but destiny itself. Superstition offered both comfort and chains. She turned to fortune tellers and folk rituals for guidance, desperate to counteract the curse. She carried charms, observed omens, and prayed with a fervor that mixed Catholic devotion with pagan belief. Yet every prophecy, every reading of her palm, seemed to reinforce the same narrative, that her fate was sealed, and her children were marked for death. By the time she and Raffaele eventually settled in Correggio, Emilia's words still echoed in her mind. She believed she had been cursed twice over, once by her mother, and once by the fortune tellers who had laid her destiny bare. Her desperation to protect her children and her obsession with fate were no longer just private struggles. They had become the driving forces of her life. And in the shadow of World War II, when bombs threatened Italy and sons were drafted into battle, Leonarda's fear reached a breaking point. It was here, in the quiet town of Correggio, that her belief in curses, prophecy, and sacrifice would soon turn deadly. By the mid-1930s, Leonarda and her husband had finally found what seemed like stability. After years of wandering from town to town, they settled in Correggio, a modest community in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. Correggio was the kind of place where everyone knew one another, where reputations carried weight, and where gossip traveled quickly through cobbled streets and market squares. Leonarda built for herself an image that contradicted the turmoil inside her. To neighbors, she was warm, approachable, and even generous. She had a sharp wit and the kind of maternal presence that drew people in. Though she had never been wealthy, she supplemented her husband's modest income by telling fortunes, reading palms, and offering advice steeped in folk wisdom. In Italy of the 1930s, fortune-telling was both frowned upon by the authorities and quietly accepted by the people. Families still whispered of omens, curses, and the evil eye. Women in particular sought comfort in the idea that destiny could be glimpsed through cards or stars. Leonarda's services were not just tolerated, they were valued. Her predictions carried weight, and her home became a quiet hub where townsfolk came to seek answers. To those who visited, she offered more than entertainment. She listened, she empathized. She gave them the hope of control in an uncertain world. And as Europe moved closer to war, uncertainty was the one thing people had in abundance. But behind her practiced smile, Leonarda's own anxieties grew sharper. She had 4 surviving children, the centerpieces of her existence, and each one was a source of both joy and terror. Her earlier losses had left scars that never healed. She hovered over her children, fearing illness, fearing accidents, fearing the war that loomed ever closer. One prophecy in particular tormented her. A fortune teller, years earlier, had told Leonarda, "You will marry and have children, but all your children will die." Another had warned her, "You will end in prison or in a criminal asylum." These words replayed in her mind like a mantra of doom. Every cough from a child, every letter from the government announcing new draft orders, seemed like the prophecy tightening its grip around her. In 1939, Italy entered the Second World War. Families across the country watched their sons march away in uniforms. Death became a part of daily conversation, and anxiety seeped into every household. For Leonarda, the idea of losing her children, after already burying 10, was unbearable. She began to believe that fate could be bargained with, that sacrifice might stave off loss. Her superstitious rituals grew more elaborate. Some accounts suggest she performed protective charms, burned offerings, and sought out omens in everyday events. Her mind, already fragile, fused folklore with desperate maternal instinct. Neighbors saw only a devoted mother and a respected fortune teller. They did not see the storm gathering in her thoughts. They did not hear the logic forming in her head, that only by offering another life could she protect the lives of her children. Still, her home in Correggio provided the perfect cover. It was a place of trust. Women came to her for advice, for hope, for direction. They confided in her. They wrote down what she told them, and they rarely questioned her instructions. Leonarda was not a predator in the shadows. She was a woman already inside the lives of her victims, woven into their trust. That trust, when the war tightened its grip and her paranoia grew unbearable, became a weapon. By the late 1930s, she had drawn her own conclusion. The fortune tellers had been right. Fate was against her, but she would not surrender quietly. If destiny demanded death, she would choose who paid the price. Her reasoning twisted into ritual. She convinced herself that human sacrifice was the only way to shield her children. Killing, to her, was not murder. It was insurance. It was protection. And when the first woman came to her for advice, unaware that she was stepping into the role of sacrifice, Leonarda was ready. The Soap-Maker of Correggio was about to emerge. The first victim was Faustina, a lonely spinster in her late 60s. She was known in Correggio as a woman who longed for companionship, someone who dreamed of marriage even in her later years. To most, Faustina's hopes were a harmless eccentricity, but to Leonarda, they were an opportunity. Faustina had often visited Leonarda for fortune-telling, seeking reassurance that her future held something more than solitude. In 1939, Leonarda presented her with exactly what she wanted to hear. She claimed to have found Faustina a husband. A wealthy man from a nearby town, she said, was ready to wed her. There was, however, a condition. Faustina must keep the arrangement secret, even from her closest friends. And when the time came, she would need to leave Correggio quietly to avoid gossip. Leonarda dictated letters for Faustina to write to her relatives and acquaintances. The letters explained that she had found happiness at last, that she was leaving to start her new life, and that she would not be returning. Faustina, trusting her fortune teller, copied the words obediently. The letters would later serve as a grim cover story, mailed only after she was already gone. On the day of her departure, Leonarda invited Faustina to her home under the pretense of final preparations. What awaited her inside was no celebration, but a carefully laid trap. Accounts from Leonarda's later confession described the moment with chilling simplicity. As Faustina prepared to leave, Leonarda struck her from behind with a heavy axe. Faustina fell, and Leonarda finished the job swiftly. There was no prolonged struggle. Then came the ritual. Leonarda dragged the body into a small dark room where a large cauldron stood waiting. She dismembered Faustina and boiled the remains. Flesh melted into thick, fatty liquid. Bones softened, collapsing under the heat. The process was methodical, almost clinical. In her memoir written years later, Leonarda described the results without hesitation. She reduced Faustina to soap. She also collected the blood, mixing it into batter for cakes. The pastries, she insisted, were sweet and crisp. Neighbors would later recall being offered those very cakes with coffee, never suspecting the ingredients. To Leonarda, Faustina's death was not a crime. It was a sacrifice. One life, traded for the safety of her children. But fate would not be satisfied with only one. Only weeks after Faustina Setti disappeared, Leonarda was already preparing her next sacrifice. Her second victim was Francesca Soavi, a middle-aged woman who had once worked as a schoolteacher. Francesca was practical, intelligent, and proud of her education. But like many in wartime Italy, she was struggling. Teaching positions were scarce, and she longed for stability. Leonarda, ever the confidant, offered her a solution. She told Francesca that she had arranged a secure job at a prestigious school for girls in Piacenza. The offer was enticing: steady pay, respectable work, and a chance to escape the uncertainties of Correggio. Just as she had with Faustina, Leonarda insisted on secrecy. Francesca must not tell anyone until the position was finalized. Instead, she should write farewell letters, explaining to friends and family that she had accepted the job, that she was relocating, and that she was happy about the opportunity. Once again, Leonarda dictated the words. Once again, Francesca copied them in her own handwriting, sealing her disappearance before it happened. On September 5, 1940, Francesca arrived at Leonarda's home for what she believed was the final step before her departure. Leonarda greeted her warmly, ushered her inside, and closed the door. What happened next followed the same grim ritual. Leonarda attacked her with an axe, killing her quickly. Then she dismembered the body and fed the pieces into the cauldron. In her later account, Leonarda claimed that Francesca's flesh, once rendered, produced soap of a more refined quality than Faustina's. She collected the fat, turned it into bars, and distributed them around her home. The blood once again was used to bake cakes. She offered them to neighbors who praised their taste. No one suspected that two women had already vanished into Leonarda's kitchen. The letters explained their absence. The cakes masked the evidence. The soap, used for cleaning clothes and hands, erased the last physical traces, and all the while, Leonarda told herself she was fighting destiny. One more life offered, one more safeguard for her children. But even with two sacrifices, her fears did not rest. The war raged on. Bombings intensified, and Leonarda began to believe that fate still demanded more. That demand would lead her to her third and final victim. The third and final victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a woman of far greater prominence than the others. Virginia was a former soprano, once celebrated on the stage of La Scala in Milan. Though her glory days were behind her, she still carried herself with elegance. She was well-connected, cultured, and proud of her past. Unlike Faustina or Francesca, Virginia was not desperate. She was ambitious. She wanted more than the quiet life of Correggio. Leonarda saw her chance. She told Virginia that she had arranged employment in Florence, an enviable position as a secretary for a wealthy impresario. For Virginia, who had once basked in the grandeur of opera halls, the offer seemed like a dignified second act. As with the others, Leonarda urged secrecy. No one must know until the job was secure. Once again, farewell letters were dictated and written in Virginia's neat hand, explaining that she had found work in Florence and was starting a new life. On September 30th, 1940, Virginia arrived at Leonarda's home for what she believed was the beginning of that new chapter. She entered the small, tidy house. Leonarda welcomed her with warmth. The door closed. What followed was the same ritual, but this time, Leonarda herself admitted that Virginia's body produced the richest results. In her later memoir, written while imprisoned, she described the process with chilling precision. I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred until everything dissolved into a thick, dark mush. I poured the mixture into several buckets and emptied them in a nearby septic tank. As for the blood, I waited until it coagulated, dried it in the oven, ground it, and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, and eggs, as well as a bit of margarine. Kneading all the ingredients together, I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit. They were delicious. Her description was horrifying not just for its detail, but for its casual tone. To Leonarda, this was not murder. It was housekeeping. It was ritual. But this time, her confidence betrayed her. Virginia's sudden disappearance did not go unnoticed. Unlike the previous victims, Virginia had a family who was both watchful and influential. Her sister grew suspicious when the letters arrived, finding their tone unconvincing. Virginia, she insisted, would not have left so suddenly, nor in such secrecy. That suspicion would soon draw the attention of authorities, and for the first time, Leonarda's carefully constructed lies began to unravel. To outsiders, Leonarda Cianciulli's home in Correggio seemed ordinary, a narrow, modest house on a quiet street. But behind its doors, she had transformed her kitchen into a place of ritual, a workshop where superstition, desperation, and death combined. Each killing followed the same structure, a promise of new opportunity, letters dictated to erase the victim's presence, the sudden, efficient strike of the axe. Then the ritual cleansing, the body stripped of individuality, reduced to fat and blood, reimagined into something useful. In her own words, Leonarda insisted this was not savagery, it was practicality. She claimed she boiled the bodies not only to dispose of them, but to purify them. Their fat, rendered down, became bars of soap. Their blood, baked into cakes, became sustenance. Nothing was wasted. Everything was transformed. And this was crucial for her twisted logic. Leonarda believed she was not committing murder, but sacrifice. Each victim was offered to fate in exchange for the survival of her children. By transforming their remains into household items, she believed she was channeling their essence, converting death into protection. Neighbors recalled her generosity. She gave away cakes, often with coffee, smiling warmly as they ate. She gifted soap to acquaintances. No one questioned her motives. The thought that these small tokens might contain human remains was unimaginable. It was this blend of the ordinary and the macabre that made her crimes so disturbing. The cauldron in her kitchen was both a domestic tool and a vessel of ritual slaughter. The cakes on the table were both hospitality and horror. By the time Virginia Cacioppo vanished, Leonarda had convinced herself that she had mastered fate. She had outwitted the prophecy that had haunted her since childhood. She had made her sacrifices, and her children, for now, were safe. But fate has a way of circling back. And the very steps Leonarda took to conceal her crimes would become the evidence that destroyed her. On September 30th, 1940, Virginia Cacioppo walked into Leonarda Cianciulli's home. By nightfall, she was gone. In most circumstances, Leonarda's cover would have held. The dictated letters mailed after the victim's death were convincing enough to satisfy casual acquaintances. They had worked for Faustina Setti. They had worked for Francesca Soavi. But Virginia was different. Virginia came from a family of influence, and her sudden disappearance raised alarm almost immediately. Her sister, suspicious of the farewell letters, noted their stilted tone. Virginia's words seemed forced, unnatural, unlike her usual correspondence. She did not believe her sister would abandon her life in Correggio without a proper goodbye. The letters were taken to the police. At first, suspicion did not fall on Leonarda. She was, after all, a respected figure in town. She had baked cakes for neighbors, offered charms and fortunes, and presented herself as a woman of kindness. But Correggio was a small place. Virginia had last been seen entering Leonarda's home, and whispers spread quickly. The police questioned Leonarda. At first, she maintained her story. Virginia had visited, yes, but only briefly. She claimed she knew nothing of her departure. Yet the inconsistencies mounted. The letters, which bore Virginia's handwriting but Leonarda's dictation, began to look like evidence rather than reassurance. Then came the turning point. Authorities discovered that Virginia's jewelry had been sold by Leonarda shortly after her disappearance. For a woman of modest means, this was damning. The investigation intensified. Neighbors were interviewed. Rumors began to swirl. Stories of Leonarda's fortune-telling, her strange rituals, her obsession with protecting her children. In wartime Italy, where suspicion and paranoia already simmered, the tale of a soap maker hiding secrets in her kitchen took on a life of its own. Under mounting pressure, Leonarda broke. Her confession was not the tearful release of a guilty conscience. It was calm, matter-of-fact, even boastful. She admitted to the killings of Faustina Setti, Francesca Soavi, and Virginia Cacioppo. She described the process in precise detail: the axe, the cauldron, the soap, the cakes. She even corrected the police when they failed to capture the method exactly. According to accounts, when an officer suggested she had simply discarded the blood, she interrupted. "Not true. I used it to make tea cakes, and I served them to visitors. They were very good." To the investigators, the casual tone was almost more chilling than the acts themselves. There was no remorse, no hesitation. Leonarda presented her crimes not as atrocities, but as necessary rituals, sacrifices demanded by fate to protect her children. When asked about the implements used in the murders, she mentioned the axe without flinching. The cauldron, she explained, had been scrubbed clean. But the details she shared, the boiling, the soap, the pastries, were beyond anything the investigators had expected. In a final gesture of twisted practicality, Leonarda told them she had given a copper ladle, used to stir the mixture of flesh and soda, to her son Giuseppe. She explained with pride that he used it to make soup. The police were stunned. By the end of 1940, Leonarda Cianciulli was arrested. She had moved from trusted neighbor to infamous killer, her name already whispered across Italy with disgust and fascination. The stage was set for a trial that would horrify the public and immortalize her in history as La Saponificatrice di Correggio, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. The trial of Leonarda Cianciulli began in Reggio Emilia in 1946, 6 years after her arrest. The war had ended, Mussolini was dead, and Italy was a nation trying to rebuild. Yet when Leonarda appeared in court, the country's gaze shifted back to the horrors of Correggio. The press descended eagerly. This was not just another murder trial. This was a story of cannibalistic pastries, human soap, and a mother who killed to protect her children. The headlines wrote themselves. Ordinary Italians, already familiar with tales of witches and fortune-tellers, found in Leonarda a living embodiment of their darkest folklore. And Leonarda did nothing to soften her image. In court, she was calm, composed, and even proud. She corrected prosecutors when they misstated her methods, explaining the exact ratio of caustic soda needed to dissolve flesh. She described her cakes as though sharing a recipe. Her testimony was delivered with the precision of a housewife discussing domestic chores. Observers were horrified, but also transfixed. Here was a woman who had boiled her victims in a cauldron, baked their blood into desserts, and served them with a smile, recounting the acts with no trace of shame. When asked why she did it, Leonarda repeated what she had told investigators. She killed to save her children. Fate had cursed her, she insisted, and only by offering lives in exchange could she protect the ones she loved. To her, these were not murders, but sacrifices. Her children were present during parts of the proceedings. The irony was brutal. She had killed for them, yet now they were forced to hear the grisly details of what she had done in their name. The court, however, was not swayed by superstition or maternal obsession. On October 15, 1946, Leonarda Cianciulli was found guilty of 3 counts of murder. Her sentence was severe: 30 years in prison, followed by 3 years in a criminal asylum. Leonarda served her time without incident, though she never abandoned the narrative that she had acted out of love. In 1970, at the age of 76, she died of cerebral apoplexy in the women's asylum of Pozzuoli. But even in death, her legacy endured. The name Soap-Maker of Correggio became a permanent mark on Italian criminal history. The story of Leonarda Cianciulli lingers in history not only because of the brutality of her crimes, but because of the strange intimacy behind them. She did not kill for money. She did not kill for pleasure. She killed because she believed the world had cursed her, and that only through blood could she rewrite destiny. To this day, Italians remember her as La Saponificatrice di Correggio, the soap maker. The nickname strips away her humanity, reducing her to the very products she created from her victims. Soap, cakes, domestic items infused with horror. Her crimes have been retold in countless forms, whispered in Italian households, dissected in criminology studies, dramatized in books and documentaries. She became a grotesque figure in true crime lore, standing alongside other infamous killers of the 20th century. Yet unlike many, her motive was uniquely rooted in maternal obsession and superstition. In Leonarda's world, fate was not abstract. It was an enemy. Every prophecy she had ever been told weighed heavily on her mind. Every child lost convinced her that destiny had already claimed its price. And when war threatened to take her surviving children, she fought back with the only tools she believed she had: ritual, sacrifice, and murder. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How far can fear and grief drive a person? At what point does love, twisted, desperate, unyielding, transform into something monstrous? Leonarda Cianciulli believed she was a mother protecting her children. History remembers her as a killer who boiled flesh and baked blood into pastries. Both are true, and that contradiction is what makes her story so haunting. Even decades later, the image remains vivid. A quiet Italian kitchen, a black cauldron simmering, and the faint smell of soap mingling with the scent of cakes fresh from the oven. Neighbors sat at her table, sipping coffee, savoring her hospitality, never knowing what they consumed. For Leonarda, each slice of cake, each bar of soap, was a ward against fate, a talisman forged in blood. But no ritual, no superstition, no cauldron could protect her from the final truth, that her legacy would not be her children's survival, but the horror of her methods. Leonarda Cianciulli died in 1970, yet the echo of her crimes endures. And the final chill is this: she was not a monster hiding in shadows, but a neighbor smiling across the table, offering you a cake